Now, let me preface by saying that most of my work is not in Madhyamaka, so I don't have a well-defined position like Yen and Dan. I have mostly questions, and I'm coming here in a way to get more questions, to get more answers. So it's going to be a bunch of questions for me. And they pertain to the deep philosophical issue that Sandy and Jay raised, as well as methodological issues as well. Now, let me start with the methodology. Obviously, how we interpret Nagarjuna. One thing that I find strange in Madhyamaka, because I'm not really a Madhyamaka scholar, is that Madhyamaka seems to have a kind of peculiar cyclic nature in which old arguments come again and again. Hence, we have kind of revival of, and I guess it says something about Madhyamaka more than about scholarship. Still, I think the paper, to me, raised a fundamental question, which is, what is the method that we follow? Sandy claims to follow a kind of historical method, but does he really follow that method? Does he really look at the text closely and its relation with the context in which Nagarjuna is thinking? I don't see that in the paper, and I'm not sure what he does. Jay, on the other hand, does something I'm more familiar with, which is something like philosophical reconstruction. And it's something I like a lot. For me, the question is, what are the constraints on that method? That is, often I find myself using that method because I like to say something, but is this really all the constraints that we have, or do we need to think more carefully about how the text actually constrains our philosophical interpretation? And that's a question I really don't have an answer, and that's a question I want to throw out for debate. Now, in the case of Madhyamaka, maybe there are more constraints. I'm not sure, but that's, for me, an important question. Now, my own method in dealing with Madhyamaka, in as much as I deal with Madhyamaka, is to look from the truth from high above, which is the truth coming from the Tibetan tradition. And I say this, obviously, to provoke Sandy, who thinks that Tibetans are a bunch of country bumpkins who are just limited to repeat tenets and things like that. So that's my method, and you know, there are certain things I can't avoid. I was struck in reading the papers how much we are constrained in our thinking by our biography, the things we study and the things we revolt against, and so on. And I think it's true of all of us. Now, when I look at the Tibetan tradition, obviously, well, in the early days, I think a lot of us, myself, but probably others, were obviously extremely impressed by the quality of that tradition, of its thinking, of its commentary, of its philosophical interpretation. And this has not changed. What I think has changed for me and for many people is a realization that the best way to understand to use the Tibetan tradition, or at least a really fruitful way to use this tradition, is not so much to base our interpretation on one particular thinker, but to look at as much as possible to the tradition as a whole. And when we look at the tradition as a whole, I think it provides a very interesting guideline about some of the important fault lines in the Indian tradition here, Madhyamaka. So if we look at Tibet, I think we can see that there is a very important question that is very germane to what the papers here talk about, which is the question of what Tibetans have called thesislessness, Kelen Kundrel, which is a question which I take fundamentally in the following way. Is Madhyamaka a philosophy, as Dan has explained, for example, Dan and Yan, an anti-foundationalist, an anti-essentialist, an anti-realist philosophy, or is it the deconstruction of all philosophy? I was educated partly by Cora Diamond, for whom this is the central question to ask in the interpretation of Wittgenstein, and so later Wittgenstein, obviously. And in a way, I think the Tibetan tradition seemed to be indicating something similar for Nagarjuna and Madhyamaka. Is it a philosophy, or is it more the deconstruction of philosophy, or as I like to say these days, and the very beneficial influence of Jay, skepticism, though my understanding of skepticism is slightly different from that of Jay. Or we could use another term, quietism. And in the Tibetan tradition, we see two important streams of interpretation. One which starts with Chaba-Chökyi Senge and culminates in Tsongkhapa and his wonderful reinterpretation or interpretation of Madhyamaka. And Tsongkhapa is very clear that Madhyamaka is a philosophy. It is an anti-essentialist philosophy or anti-foundationalist, for as you want to put it. And there's, Tsongkhapa makes, I think, a very persuasive argument. There is, however, another tradition in the Tibetan Buddhism, which holds a rather different view of Madhyamaka, a view that, for example, Sandy seems to be unaware of, which is the tradition of Patsap Nimadra. And that tradition is very important in Tibet, though it has not received the same degree of examination. I mean, right now it's starting to get really taken seriously. And that's what I would call a skeptical interpretation of Nagarjuna. Now, that skeptical interpretation is that Nagarjuna's point is not so much to provide a philosophy, though he may do that at some level, but is really to bring us to a point of complete suspension of any kind of belief about how things really are. So for Nagarjuna, the point is not so much to drive home the truth of certain belief, rather to make and understand the nonsense of holding to belief about how things are. And that's what I would call skepticism in, obviously, the ancient Pyrrhonian sense of the term. Now, so we have these two traditions. Now, let me say that even if we take the skeptical or quietist interpretation of Nagarjuna, that in no way, in the Tibetan mind at least, translate into a view of Nagarjuna as an irrationalist, because it's very clear that Nagarjuna, in the perspective from high above, it's very clear that Nagarjuna uses reason. Yeah, Tibet is high, so it is the truth from high above. Use reason, right? And so the question then becomes, what is the status of this reasoning? We started to talk about that question. I think that's a really important question. The presence of these two streaks of interpretation in Nagarjuna, for me, raise two lines of inquiry. One is, it seems pretty clear that these two streaks of interpretation are there in Nagarjuna. And so we need to come to terms, and this was my great dissatisfaction with Jay's paper, which is that Jay claims that in a way he reconciled the two, but it looks more like a magical trick than a really reconciliation. And I'm not sure how Jay wants to do that. For the Tibetan tradition, obviously, the reconciliation is done in prioritizing one over the other, right? And we can follow that, or we can try to find a more innovative way to try to bring the two together. So this is one line of inquiry, which I think is very important. And for me, an interpretation of Nagarjuna, which does not take seriously both sides, is seriously lacking. And on that, I share Sandy's trepidation about the fact that maybe Jay does not take in seriously enough this quietist streak in Nagarjuna. Second line, which is interesting and which maybe David, who gave such a wonderful talk yesterday, can help us, is to understand to which extent this opposition between a quietist or skeptical interpretation and a, let's call it, anti-essentialist interpretation of Nagarjuna map onto the infamous distinction between Svatantrika and Prasangika. Now, I don't take this distinction to be a distinction so much as school as a debate between Chandrakirti and Bhava Viveka. So I wonder to which extent it's fair to attribute to Bhava Viveka, for example, an anti-essentialist interpretation of Nagarjuna, or to which extent this is actually not quite what Bhava Viveka had in mind. The Tibetan tradition, for example, Mipam, does not think that this distinction that I made between a view of thesislessness and a view imputing to Nagarjuna thesis of a certain kind is the way to understand the distinction between Svatantrika and Prasangika. But I think that's that may be a useful way to think about what the difference is. And I think we started to open this discussion with this idea of good reasoning. And I think what I would like to hear more, since I'm not here to provide answers, but to raise questions, is what is a good reasoning? Is good reasoning just in its logical form? And what are the commitments that a good reasoning implies on the part of the participants in the debate? One way that the Tibetan tradition often takes this reasoning, I mean, the Patsap line of interpretation takes this reasoning as being jenda, parasiddha, right? Just meant to work on the basis of the opponent's views, right? And so that would be a kind of minimal view of the power of reasoning, but certainly that does not make Nagarjuna into an irrationalist. And so for me, I think where I want to try to think is, if you take this view, what is the transition between the conventional and the ultimate? How is that transition operated? And since it's not operated in this perspective, right? Out of kind of, you don't get to the truth of the conclusion, right? How are reasonings operating when you don't think that the point of reasoning is to provide, make some kind of probative argument to lead you to some kind of truth, as for example, Dan thinks, but rather to lead to the suspension of all beliefs, right, about how things really are.